It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we're going to talk about Dana White, who was caught up in lots of good questioning from interviews, pressed pretty hard by some of the interviewers. We're also going to talk about how some of the media is being blocked from the boxing that's taking place this weekend. We're going to talk about Eddie Hearn and how he's not very impressed with Dana White's plans. We're going to talk about Mark Shapiro and all the things that he had to say at the tech conference. But if you want access to all the things that we're going to talk about today, you're going to need to subscribe with your coins, because some of this will be behind a paywall. But it's a really, really good episode, and I highly recommend it. But I recommend all of them. John, don't you agree? All of our shows are recommendable and definitely subscribable.
Yeah, we have no Godfather Part 3s in our catalog. It's all 1 and 2s.
All 1 and 2s. So
Yeah.
How the heck are you? It's been like an hour since I talked to you.
Yeah, it's a busy day today. I was on the phone for a long time doing something for my mom, and so that I was talking to DirecTV AT&T for her, and my head still hurts. Let's just put that their consumer hotline, or their help hotline, or whatever it's called, is just not very useful.
Oh, well. And also, didn't you have some a run-in with your cat trying to finagle extra treats out of you in a very, very smart way, I might add?
You know what? That was told to you as a personal thing. That was not to be shared with others. But yes, my cat, I've somewhat trained my cat to get treats when I pull out a certain chair. And I made the mistake not noticing that she was hiding, lurking around, and pulled the chair out for a second as I was cleaning up after dinner, and she hopped in it. So I had to give her a treat right before the show. So we're starting 5 minutes late because she beat me to get the treat. And then she plays a very smart game where she pretends she doesn't see that I got the treat, so that I sit down, then jumps in my lap so that she can eat it really quick and then run back to the chair and get a second treat. So I got that. I am being outsmarted by my cat. Let's put it that way.
I think that's the most brilliant thing ever. I mean, cats, man, sometimes they play dumb, but your cat, that's one of the smartest things I've ever heard of a cat doing. So,
well, that's why you should get a dog, people. My
hat is tipped. So I guess we should go ahead and get started, because Dana White has been embroiled in some interviews this week, and some of them are much better than others. And we're going to start off with one from Amber Dixon of PBS Vegas. Man, she had a good one. Now, Max Kellerman also had one for Ring Magazine, but Dixon's really stood out, and she got a lot of praise for it. What do you think that she did that's getting her so much praise?
Well, I think the easiest way to understand is watch her interview, then watch Kellerman's. And watch that they both get a lot of the same answers to their questions. They end up with the same answers from Dana White. So you can't, you can't credit Amber for like getting answers that no one else can get from Dana White. Kellerman got the same, but just look at the way that the questions are posed and framed. And Amber is not, Miss Dixon, I should say, is not being like a very confrontational. She's not being mean-spirited. She's very polite, asking very smart questions, and getting, asking stuff that Dana White, again, I saw some people saying, "Oh, these are her questions. These are answers we already know." They're not like she's, it's not 60 Minutes that she's capturing them as, this is not Spotlight, and we got the Catholic Church in Boston. We finally nailed them. This is, these are very straightforward questions that are proper questions to ask, the ones you're kind of waiting to ask that we have not seen other people ask. And so for all that, I think that's where the praise is kind of coming from, is she is asking in a polite way, very straightforward, serious questions that should be asked by the media, and having follow-ups that show that she's somewhat, at least somewhat, more than somewhat though. If you follow her at all, you know she covers boxing, so she knows this. But she can do follow-ups that other people seem to let hang and just let Dana White say what he's going to say and not do any follow-ups, and she does all that. So for that, she deserves a lot of praise. The other person probably deserves some praise. We didn't even know it to just happen right for the show. Is Sean Zettel was at the press conference, and he had a very pointed question towards Dana White. Probably a few, basically with something that I've been waiting for someone to ask Dana White is about why is he supporting bringing the Ali Act, modifying the Ali Act for boxing, especially when he had just paid out $375 million to UFC fighters, and he's facing additional antitrust lawsuits. So that's a quality question. He didn't get an answer, but still, that's the type of question you'd hope to see asked. And I was also pleasantly surprised by the audience. There was a few smacking of boos, but some clapping too for him. So I believe if that had taken place at a UFC press conference in, let's say, Australia or something, that he would have been ran out of the building by the fans.
I do like the way that he kept pressing with follow-ups. He didn't let himself be deterred by Dana trying to sort of bully him into saying that you need to be asking these guy questions here. It's a boxing conference and the promoter is there to also take questions. And so for Dana to try to deflect and Sean to keep pressing with more follow-ups, I thought that was fantastic.
Well, especially considering they've made a big deal how this is TKO entering, or Zuffa Boxing, I should say. Now they have an official name, entering the boxing landscape, that this is a big deal that Dana White is going to be the promoter. And as part of their entrance into boxing is the Ali Act. So I think it's more than fair game. It was absurd in many ways that Dana White said he was being an asshole for trying to ask that question.
Yes, indeed. White discussed fighter pay with both Dixon and Kellerman and said it was a myth that boxers make more. Is he telling the truth here?
Well, the myth, according to White, is that boxers make more than UFC fighters. I think that's how he frames it normally. Not MMA fighters, that the myth is that they make more than UFC fighters. And there is some truth to that. So but there's also a lot of caveats on that. I think that's why Dana White will say this. And because he knows people are not going to, unless they're us, they're not going to deep dive into this to fully explain it. When you talk about, first of all, remember, UFC fighters are a small share of all MMA fighters. The total number of fighters per year, according to total number of professional fights, I should say, worldwide, I believe that Topology showed us before that the UFC was like 3% of those fights globally last year. So it's a small percentage of the total number of MMA fights are UFC fights. And since the UFC, according to their own, internal records and according to their own, what their lenders and then credit ratings are, have about 90% of the market, maybe it's gone down a little since then, but it's still, they have a vast, vast, vast portion of the total MMA market. Them having all the top fighters in MMA makes sense. So the average UFC fighter should definitely make more than the average boxer by far, because there's tens of thousands of boxers. It's just not a good comparison. Now, the other part that he's kind of correct about, I believe, is that there's a premium for UFC fighters. And that premium is when you get in the UFC, you automatically get at minimum a $10,000 to show, $10,000 to win contract. There are many boxers who might be in a similar position in their career as a UFC fighter who enters the UFC that's not going to get that much money. And you can see a comparison is the regionals for MMA. They don't get anything close to that money. UFC entry-level guys make more than fighters in similar positions in MMA. They're the highest paid. And so there is a premium. And when I went through the athletic commissions, remember I went through all their payouts in 2019 for all the states that reported, and I compared boxing to MMA, we will see that there is a bump up at about the 85 percentile. That's where a UFC entry fighter is for MMA. And so they jump up above boxing. And then when you get above them into the top, 5% of all fighters, boxing again overtakes them on reported pay. And then below that number, MMA, the median MMA fighter is still not well, but let's say, I believe, I'm going off memory, that boxing was around $2,700 a medium. The median, in other words, 50% would get paid more, 50% less on the reported payouts. And MMA was about $2,200 for reported payout. There's a couple different ways I did it, so I'd have to go back and double check. But that's that's a ballpark figure. That's probably close to accurate. But the point is that the average median boxing purse in the United States, reported by the ABC in 2019, was that boxers made more. And the reason I stopped in 2019 is because we'll probably talk about this later. We ran into trouble getting payouts from the commissions. Now, beyond that, we have some other information. We know from discovery in the UFC antitrust case, the Levy-Zuffa case, that the UFC at least paid during the class period, 17 to 20% of their revenue to the fighters. We know they projected that it'd be less than 20% in the future. We know from the disclosure of the settlement that there was an analysis of how much they'd paid fighters going from after the league class up until sometime in 2023. And that ended up being about, I think, 16.9%. Don't quote me, but right around there. A percentage of the pay was going from revenue was going to the fighters. So UFC fighters make, I mean, it's fair to say, pretty obvious, I think, at this point. It's, I don't think it's going out on a limb to say they get below 20% of the revenue. Boxing, on the other hand, we know, again, from the antitrust lawsuit from Discovery, as well as the Al Heyman suit, the Golden Boy versus Al Heyman, is that boxing promoters pay about 60 to 70% of their revenue. So as a revenue share, they pay more. And today, I mean, according to the interviews and comments by promoters and people in the boxing industry, it might be higher than 60 and 70% for boxing payout for revenue. So boxers get more of the revenue. Now, okay, that's kind of spells you enough. But then there's the question: do they really, do we have specific fighters that they make more? And it's interesting that Dana White brought up two specific fighters. He brought up Ronda Rousey and he brought up Conor McGregor. And the interesting thing about McGregor is we can do a direct comparison of McGregor's pay, not just his income, but also his revenue that was generated by him as a comparison. And we can do it against Canelo Alvarez, another star. So back in 2015 and 16, we know, thanks to the antitrust lawsuit, that in 2015, his two big pay-per-views did about 35 million in revenue. And then I think that's 189 did about that was the estimate. And then 40 to 45 million for 191 when he beat Aldo. And then in 2016, we know that his Diaz fights did like 61 million for one of them, 66 million for another. I think that might have been the Alvarez fight, and then another one around 60 million. So we'll just round it up and say he made 180 million in 2016. On 3 fights. He didn't make 100 million, I should be clear. The UFC, those events generated $180 million. His payouts during that period, which we know the exact payout number because it was disclosed in the antitrust suit. I should be specific on here. His name wasn't disclosed, but it's pretty easy to decipher which of those payouts were his. That he got 3.3 million at UFC 89. 4.5 million against Aldo at 191, 5.6 million, give or take 40,000 against on both his fights versus Nate Diaz, and finally 6.8 million for Eddie Alvarez. So if we're just looking at 2016, the last 3, he did about $18 million he was paid on $180 million in revenue that the UFC generated. Now, I'm going to credit him with most of that revenue because you look at another event around that time, the ones with Demetrius Johnson, they generated like 10 to 15 million in total revenue. So obviously Conor McGregor, I would argue, has a huge impact on the revenue the UFC was generating at that time. And for that, he got about 10% of the total revenue. Now, in comparison, let's look at Canelo Alvarez, who, again, we have because of the Golden Boy lawsuit against Al Heyman. They revealed what their costs were for all their fighters. So in 2015, he had 2 fights, one with Kirkland and one with Miguel Cotto. Now, the Cotto one was a co-promotion, so only percentage of the revenue was addressed to Canelo. I believe the talk was that 75% of the split was going to Cotto. So Cotto got the vast majority of the money for that event. But even then, they attribute Golden Boy, that is, about $30.7 million that year from those two events to Canelo fighting on him. And Canelo's cost of goods, and the cost of, in other words, what they paid him for his services and for his training, things like that, because they cover the training often, is $20.8 million. So he got 2/3 of the revenue that they said he generated. And in 2016, he fought one fight versus Khan, which is a Golden Boy promotion, which generated, they said, $24 million and $50,000 was attributed to Canelo, and $3.6 million was attributed to Khan. So the total revenue was $27.6 million total, 27.7 to be round up to the closest number, of which Canelo got $13.3 million in payment, and Khan got $2 million. Should note, in the Heyman, the suit Golden Boy had against Heyman, I think they said Khan got paid $6 million. And one theory I heard is that the Khan had the international rights, and so that additional revenue went to him, so he got $6 million actually. But again, you look at it, the amount of revenue they're generating is not as much as it's a large amount of money. These were big successful events, but not as much as Conor McGregor was generating. And yet, not only is the overall pay Canelo getting multiples what Conor got, the percentage he's getting is much, much higher. And so when Dana White says that UFC fighters get paid more, he's right on the median for UFC versus MMA. But when he cites that the top guys get paid more, no, it's pretty clear that the top guys in boxing get paid more. And they get paid more based on the performance. You kill what you eat, he says. Well, the UFC fighters don't get to eat as much as what they kill, where boxers get to eat more of what they kill. And for that, I think it's pretty obvious that boxers, and it's not just a handful of the very top guys. We were talking about a swath of the very top fighters. Again, a small percentage, but the UFC, we're talking about a very small percentage of the top fighters. So the top boxers, a number of them. I think one time I was talking to someone and we estimated that, if you took the top 100 fighters, MMA and boxing, about a quarter of them on that top 100, a third max would probably be MMA fighters. But so the vast majority of the top 100 highest paid fighters would be boxers. And if you get to the top 10, you might be lucky to get one or two MMA fighters at the very bottom of that list. So, I think this is Dana White again. He's being somewhat truthful, I guess, but he's also leaving a lot of details out when he says this. And he also does not expect people to do their homework, I guess.
He also said that there's no gag order on discussing fighter pay. Do you buy this?
Can I just say no? Well, he says that all the time. He says, they're free to talk. There's no reason you can't learn what fighter pay. It's interesting. He says the two things. One, he says, no one knows anything about the business. And then he says, you're free to whatever to find out, even though it's not readily available. Although I should note, we do know a lot because, again, the lawsuit and things like that. And yet I am always disappointed when members of the media talk to them and they don't bring up the actual numbers from the lawsuit and confront them with it. So if you're going to interview Dana White and you need some help, not jerk questions, just crafting questions that are accurate, that are a little more in depth, just shoot me an email. I will help you craft a few questions. But to get back to the gag issue, one thing Dana White, he'll say they're all free to talk, and then he'll ignore the part in the UFC contracts about confidentiality that says the fighter shall not disclose to any third party other than fighter's agent and professional advisor in their capacity as such on a need-to-know basis any information with respect to the terms and provisions of this agreement or any bout agreement, including any of the amounts paid pursuant to this agreement or any bout agreement. It's pretty clear there. You are not supposed to talk to anybody about your agreements. And we know that because fighters will often say that when you try to talk to them, I'm not allowed to tell anybody about this. Now the UFC can say, we don't care. You're free to talk. Well, you know what? That would work actually in an arbitration, because you have to go to arbitration. Remember, you probably signed an arbitration agreement. That would work when you go to arbitration. But it still has a chilling effect on fighters. I think they understand the UFC doesn't want them to talk. In addition, the states no longer disclose payouts like they used to. California still does. But Nevada Senate Bill 29, which was passed back in May of 2019, that stopped Nevada from revealing information about fighter pay. And if people remember anything about that situation, it was passed. It was supported by the NSAC Commissioner Stacey Alonso at the time, and Stacey Alonso used to work at Station Casinos, used to work with the Fertittas. Also, all the members of the casino at the Athletic Commission board, all the committee members, state senators and such, all had received donations from Zuffa and Station Casinos at the time. So you see a lot of connections there. And at the time, I remember Alonso gave comments during a committee hearing before the vote on that bill, or before that bill was enforced, talking about how they had to do it to make sure that the big promoters would stay in Nevada instead of going places where they did not have to disclose. So they got rid of it. Utah declared payout state secrets, trade secrets. And immediately after they did that, remember, they started getting events, although Utah was also paying site fees. And then Florida also passed a bill that UFC lobbied for that let them declare payouts trade secrets. So when Dana White says you're free to ask anybody about it, that seems pretty disingenuous, considering that, one, that you guys have in your contracts you can't talk about it. And two, when he says that you have to ask the commissions why they do not reveal the payouts anymore, maybe that's because you guys asked them not to do it, because we have some evidence that it seems like Zuffa, the UFC, lobbied in the case of one bill, and a lot of connections to the other people involved in the other bills, that they want the athletic commissions to stop revealing these payouts.
Now, I've got a follow-up for you on this.
Go ahead.
You mentioned that if you took this to arbitration, that would be because there are multiple instances, video proof of Dana saying that. But could it be argued, and maybe it should be argued, that he says that, but the repercussions of actually doing it, even though you could probably win in arbitration, would be because there's a threat, an unspoken threat of shitty matchmaking, and possibly your future with the company would be at stake, correct?
Yeah, I mean, there is that threat, that unspoken threat, and that people are always afraid of. Fighters in the UFC are always afraid of, to get in the bad side of the UFC. So yeah, I mean, I don't even know if they would challenge a fighter that did this, if they would go to arbitration or anything, because they know they would lose, because Dana White has said this so many times, it's basically a verbal contract agreement with the fighters that you're free to violate this portion of their agreement. But unless, who knows, maybe they're sending out addendums after each time Dana says this, they're making them sign it again to make sure they don't reveal. But even then, the fighters, even knowing that they're allowed technically to reveal this information, there's such a chilling effect over fighters. There's such the fighters are so nervous about the UFC. And this is, I mean, I'm talking from direct experience communicating with fighters recently. Fighters that, again, listen to this show, so they are much more informed than your usual fighter. Fighters that perhaps some of them voice the opinion that they do not like what the UFC is doing, that they support stuff that the UFC would probably be against, but they've made it clear they are nervous. They would never willingly come out in the open and say this, because they're afraid of what would happen to their career. Their one chance right now they have, their limited window of opportunity in mixed martial arts, that they do not want to get on the bad side of the UFC over that. And this is just like this situation. I can't imagine most fighters being willing to spill the beans on their payout, because even if they've been technically given permission to do it, they're going to be nervous about how the UFC is going to respond. Although I say, fighters, ignore that. Just call me and tell me whatever you want.
Now, Ms. Dixon asked Dana about his support for the Muhammad Ali American Boxing Revival Act. That would be these changes to the Ali Act. You mentioned on Twitter, because I refuse to call it X, that his answer was very revealing. What was revealing about it?
Well, what I found interesting about it, one, is he didn't answer the question. That's the first part I found interesting about it, because the question was, do you need this bill to be passed for you to do what you want to do, so you can do what you do in UFC in boxing? And then he gave let me give you a good example, he said, and he kind of pivoted to talking about something else. And what his talk was, he wants to build up boxing. And his talk was, his talking points was that they back in 2001, him and the Fertittas, they bought the UFC for $2 million. And now you look at the TKO stock share, it's $200 million. Look at what we've done with the sport. We've made it a multi-billion-dollar thing. He also talked about how, compared it to boxing. In boxing, they've had trillions of dollars revenue. And I don't know if that's true, but maybe if you total up the sum total of all the boxing in 20 and 21st century, maybe there's been $1 trillion in revenue generated. I'm not, that seems like it might be too large a number, but possibly. But there's nothing to show for it. Where he instead has turned the UFC into an NFL or NBA. And also that they brought in sponsors and financial firms who want to invest in the sport with them. So I thought that was telling, because his point was, when asked about the Muhammad Ali American Revival Act, which is, the same name as the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act, very close name, which was a bill to protect fighters. And they claim that this American Boxing Revival Act is supposed to do the same. When you're talking about a bill to protect fighters, you wouldn't expect an executive who, I know all these people are like, well, he has responsibility to shareholders. He has to look at that's his number one priority. But can you imagine any executive being asked about the Wagner Act, let's say, and the NLRA, or a minimum wage bill, or overtime thresholds? Would you expect them to suddenly pivot and say, yeah, the important thing about this bill is it's going to raise the price of people's stocks and shareholder value?
Yeah.
that doesn't seem accurate. You wouldn't talk about, you'd talk about what the intent of the bill was, and it's focused on workers. In this case, it's focused on the boxers. Instead, his idea of growing the sport apparently was not that the sport is, he didn't mention that the sport is much bigger. He could have said, MMA is practiced over the world, so many more people take part in it. He didn't mention that. But he also didn't mention that the athletes are making ungodly amounts of money, that they've never done better. And he could mention that, although that then brings up the question of, they're getting such a small percentage compared to boxing, and some boxers, some boxers, we should know it, according to Forbes, Usyk, Fury, and Canelo combined last year for more in boxing pay than well above the entire UFC roster. In fact, Usyk and Fury, if we believe the Forbes numbers, they might be close, because we know that, just based on the company house stuff, they probably made more than all the UFC roster last year. And so, we're growing the sport. We're growing, his idea of growing this thing is not that we're putting tons of money in the fighters' hands. His idea is we are making value for we're turning the asset more valuable. We are getting investment into the promotion from outside sources, not into the fighters' hands. That the value, we are not blowing the value. We're not losing value. That we're making an asset that shareholders can then gain wealth in the future on. And I don't know if is that a sign of a sport doing great? I'm not sure. That's a sign that the people invest in are doing great, that their shareholder, that the shareholders are worth so much. But that doesn't tell me that that's great for the boxers or fighters, the athletes or workers at all. So, in many ways, it reminds me of, and this is a talking point I've seen a lot in combat sports, like PFL, John Martin, a little while ago. We did that. We analyzed his interview. He brought that up as well about the shareholder price, that they're going to bring the value to the PFL up. And, again, it's like, is that good for the athletes in PFL? I'm not certain. I'm not sure it is, because one reason, promotions might be worth a lot is if you pay the athletes very little. It's not the same as a sports league with these teams, that there's a monopoly on entry, and you have a monopoly over a region, which means that there's a minimum number of those teams, which drive up their price. In this, the value seems to be that they are awash in cash because they can pay the athletes very low.
Max Kellerman suggested that the changes Dana White and TKO wanted to make to boxing would make him sort of like the Roger Goodell or the Nate Silver of boxing, a CEO of boxing, if you will. White did not disagree. Do you think this is their plan?
I do. I should note, though, I saw this on people quoting this interview or referencing it, and they kept mentioning the CEO of boxing, that Dana White's called himself, he wants to be a CEO of boxing. That was someone paraphrasing it. He never said he wants to be the CEO of boxing. What they did say, which Kellerman said, is he wants to be the they for boxing, and they being like Roger Goodell of the NFL, or Nate Silver of boxing, or Nate Silver of the NBA, or Dana White of the UFC. That when you talk about and professional football, the they is the NFL. When you talk about professional boxing, or professional basketball, the NBA is the they for most people. So they don't think about these other minor leagues and stuff. And they're talking about Dana White wants to do that for boxing, and White did not disagree. So I do think that's their plan, because you look at it. One is there is some discussion going on right now about what sanctioning organization belts are going to be allowed in the fight. I haven't seen clarity on that. I think the WBC is going to introduce a championship ring for the event. But Solomon said he would storm the ring to put his belt on the winner. But it looks like they're trying to keep out the sanctioning organizations, and they're going to have everything focused on the ring belt. So that's one. Dana White himself says that when talked about competition, he looks forward to competition in boxing, but he didn't mention competition in MMA. In other words, he made it clear that he doesn't compete with the other promotions. He competes with the NFL and NBA. He also, it was pretty obvious when being asked about the competition. I think it was not obvious, but it seemed like it was in reference to the athletes having competition to raise their wages. And I don't know how him competing with the NFL, NBA, and big movies raises the athlete wages. That's because that's what competition does. So I think that is kind of Dana's plan, is to have, as Mark Shapiro calls it, a closed shop for boxing, and eventually be the number one entity in boxing, which when people talk about boxing, they might not think of it the same way as you do the NFL or NBA, but they might think of it in the way like, oh, all the big fights, all the interest are in this Zuffa boxing. So when I talk boxing, I actually mean this, because the others have been relegated to a secondary position. I don't know how realistic that is. I will say one thing Dana White was really correct about in that interview with Kellerman, that there has to be a pipeline. And as he talked about it, he mentioned that we're going to do it like the Contenders. We're going to build it's also interesting. He says we're going to have the best fight the best. I don't know how good the best are when they've fought, 4 to 6 round fights. And this is like their first 8 or 10 round fight. You're not talking about the very best in the world. You're talking about regional guys and pitting them against each other, which is kind of the genius of the plan. Because if you have a closed shop, you can declare these guys the best in the world, because there's no way to pop the bubble. But to get back to the pipeline, I think he's right, and that's one thing that's hurting boxing right now, is the structure of building up fighters to move on to take on the champion has been kind of ruptured. The fans are not seeing it, not following it like they used to. Where they're setting up a system here where it sounds like Turki al-Sheikh and the Saudis will be in charge of the top fights, the 2 to 4 super fights per year, with the champions that are the biggest stars in the world in boxing. And that his goal is to give basically, I guess, a constant tournament to weed out fighters to end up with someone to be a challenger to those guys. And I don't think it's accurate, or it's the best pipeline, because again, you have to get guys to sign exclusively with Zuffa Boxing. But it is a system that they've used in the UFC, where they can bring fighters into their system, rise them up into the fans' eyeballs, under their eyes, as some sort of a contender, clueless that there's other fighters outside the promotion that might be better. But again, it gives a structure where you can see people rise to the ranks and go on to fight the champion. And that's what boxing's missing. And that's what they're trying to recreate, but one where they get to control the progress and the championship, the ascent, and the championship the ability to challenge the champion at the end.
Let's talk about Eddie Hearn here, because he did not seem too impressed with Dana White's plans. Do you think that Eddie is taking him too lightly? To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!